Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. My name is Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator, and for this video, I am once again wading into the fray of the big archaeology wars, the debate that's been happening really for like the past year or so. It's kind of intensified between Graham Hancock and academic archaeology, let's say, even that distinction. I'm just going to say Graham Hancock and archaeology. This all kind of started, well, this started with the publication of Hancock's older books, but it really kind of ramped up recently with Netflix putting out Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse show, the response by the archaeological community to Ancient Apocalypse, and then probably most famously, even more famous than the Netflix show, was Hancock's debate with Dr. Flint Dibble on the Joe Rogan Experience, which I've made a review on. A lot of people have made a review on, and that's kind of what kicked things off. And most recently, Hancock is once again making his rounds to the big podcast, including Joe Rogan, and what we're going to cover today, a video from the Lex Friedman podcast, because he's promoting season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse. So we're once again kind of getting back into the swing of things. For this video, I'm going to cover a logical fallacy that I noticed that Hancock committed during his conversation with Lex. It's one of those that's pretty common and maybe flew under the radar, but I want to go over it, and this is going to be similarly structured to the last video where I reviewed the debate between Hancock and Dibble and what I titled Hancock's Argument from Ignorance. Now, in that video, it was titled Hancock's Argument from Ignorance because I believe that Hancock was committing the logical fallacy known as the argument from ignorance. And a lot of people in the comments section of that video misinterpreted that as me saying, calling Hancock ignorant and saying that he was ignorant because of the statements he was making. That was not what I'm saying. The purpose of these videos, because I am not an archaeologist, my background is my area of expertise is in the history and philosophy of science, and even then it's a very, very narrow area. I study the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who was a historian and philosopher of science. So that's big picture general. I say all that to say I'm not an archaeologist. I don't have a background in archaeology. And the purpose of me making these videos is not to critique or to undermine, for example, what Hancock's saying about like Göbekli Tepe or the pyramids of Giza or anything like that. There are other channels which do that way better than I ever could. The purpose of these videos, for me anyway, is to kind of parse and to dissect the sorts of arguments that Hancock's making, to shed light on the fact that most of these are, let's say, logically dubious, that they're bad arguments. But to be fair here, the reason why you should go watch the actual like content videos is because logically speaking, just because an argument is bad in terms of how it's structured doesn't speak to the validity or the truth of what the person is arguing or what the claim of the argument is. Let me phrase it that way. Now, I do believe that Hancock is wrong, but I'm not in the position to say that. I'll reference some other channels who kind of go do a deep dive into the sorts of claims that Hancock's make. And I also thought that Dr. Dibble did a fantastic job in the Joe Rogan debate. If you haven't watched that, go watch that. But again, the purpose is to critique the logical theoretical structure, and this is really difficult to do in casual conversation, because in casual conversation, we're not always really careful with how we phrase and how we word things, as opposed to like an academic paper in which people are very thorough. And I have to do my hand over here because I forget if I do it over here, it's being blocked by my own graphic. Anyway, as opposed to like an academic paper or a formal debate or presentation in which people are doing kind of a premise A, premise B, premise C type of situation. In casual conversation is when we really have to be mindful of what we're going to talk about today, which are kind of informal, logical fallacies, specifically the straw man argument. But let's talk. I want to mention a little briefly about critical thinking to kind of kick things off for us. Just because I think there was a little bit of confusion in the last video I made in terms of how people were interpreting what I'm saying. Not that this was going to help at all, but so critical thinking is related to a branch in philosophy. So traditionally, philosophy is divided up into different categories: logic, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology. And we have a lot of subfields that we can get into, especially in the 20th century with hyper specialization. We don't have to go down that route. But logic is traditionally one of the classic areas of philosophy. It's one of the areas of philosophy that's still studied. And logic can be roughly divided into formal logic and informal logic. Formal logic is really like mathematical thinking, deductive reasoning. Formal logic, if you take a formal logic class in college, it's proofs and theorems, very similar to like what you would do in like algebra or something like that. It's pretty intense. I had to take a few for my undergraduate, and I still have nightmares about it. But informal logic is the sort of reasoning that's employed. We have different types of informal logic. Now, informal logic, a lot of people will categorize as inductive. There are systems of formal thinking that employ inductive reasoning. I'm not sure if I'm making a whole lot of sense here. I have in mind all of the sciences that base their findings off of empirical evidence. Any argument based off of empirical evidence is inductive. It's not deductive. It's inductive because things are contingent. Things could always be differently. That doesn't take away from the validity of inductive reasoning. As I just said, the natural sciences are based off of inductive reasoning. They're some of the strongest fields of knowledge that we have. But informal logic also plays a huge part in kind of everyday conversations, the conversations that you have with your friends, but also in like debates and critical conversations like we're going to see here, involving the communication between the archaeological community and Graham Hancock. Critical thinking, on the other hand, involves analyzing, evaluating, and synthesizing information that we gain from sources or information that we're getting from conversations in a clear, rational, and an attempt to be in an unbiased manner. And critical thinking ideally includes logical principles and logical analysis. And a big part of this is recognizing what we call logical fallacies or mistakes in reasoning. So the fallacy that I want to talk about today, that I think is represented in the video, which I'll get to here shortly, is called the straw man fallacy. So the straw man fallacy is a common informal logical fallacy where somebody misinterprets, distorts, oversimplifies, misrepresents another person's claim or another person's argument. And the reason for this misrepresentation is to make that person's claim or argument easier to refute, easier to raise objections to. So instead of addressing the actual claims, instead of the opposite of a straw man is a steel man, instead of steel man in the opponent's argument, there's a intentional or sometimes unintentional misrepresentation of the argument in order to make it easier to respond to criticize, or to knock down. In this case, it's a straw man because it's flimsy, it falls apart under a little bit of scrutiny. So we have here kind of a simple example of a straw man. One person: I'm in favor of lowering sentences for drug offenses. And then the person responds: so you think children should be running around doing drugs, right? Another example would be something along the lines of: I'm in favor of political policies that promote the buying and selling of electric vehicles. And then the person responds: oh, so you want to take away all of our gas-powered vehicles. Or a very common one that you oftentimes hear, especially in political discourse: I'm in favor of implementing some sort of gun regulation or new gun laws to make it harder for individuals to purchase firearms just off the street. Like maybe there should be some sort of background checks, psychological examination, something along those lines. And then the classic kind of bumper sticker response: oh, so you want to take away our guns, right? That's a classic example of a straw man. So a straw man works first and foremost by taking the original argument and the original position that was put forward and misrepresenting it somehow. And typically speaking, the misrepresentation happens by taking the statement to its most extreme form, distorting the argument to make it represent some extreme point. And then from that misrepresentation, it's attacked by the opponent. That is, that extreme version of the argument is then the form of the argument that's engaged with and criticized. Instead of engaging with the actual argument, this is the straw man part, we're engaging with the flimsy representation of the argument. And then it reaching a conclusion based off of the flimsy representation instead of the actual argument itself. Strawman arguments are misleading for several reasons. First and foremost, it diverts attention away from the actual argument. Usually, this diversion is done in the first place because the actual argument might be like really strong and we might not really have a great response to the actual argument. So the straw man helps us to pivot. You see this in like political debates like all the time. This is probably one of the most common political fallacies, but it diverts us away from a position that we may not feel comfortable with dealing with or maybe unable to deal with to a position where we feel comfortable attacking. Usually strawman arguments also greatly oversimplify because we're taking it to its extreme conclusion. We're taking something, an argument that may have been like really complex and nuanced, and making it kind of a caricature of itself, simplifying it, erasing all of the complex parts in order for us to present some kind of simple rebuttal of it. And this, of course, is inherently misleading. And ultimately, what this results in is that it misleads the audience away from the original argument onto the caricature to the point where the audience believes that it's the straw man that is what people are actually saying, and that is the straw man that it's the real argument. And this is, I think, what we're going to see in the portion of the Hancock interview that I want to show you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking. I want to present that before to kind of set up the conversation, but now let's jump to the video.
To me, the story that we've been talking about, it is both exciting if the mainstream archaeology narrative is correct and the one you're constructing is correct. Both are super interesting because the mainstream archaeology perspective means that there's something about the human mind from which the pyramids, these ideas spring naturally. You place humans anywhere, you place them on Mars, it's going to come out that way. So that's an interesting story of human psychology that then becomes even more interesting when you evolve out of Africa with Homo sapiens, how they think about the world. That's super interesting. And then if there's an ancient civilization, advanced civilization that explains why there's so many similar types of ideas that spread, that means that there's so much undiscovered still about the sort of the spring of these ideas of civilization that come. So to me, they're both fascinating. So I don't know why there's so much sort of infighting, but
all right. So to start off with, we kind of have this question, I guess, setting up of the question, setting up of the conversation by Lex. This video is supposed to be more focused on Hancock and Hancock's response, but I really don't like the way that Lex did this. Now, Lex Friedman, if you don't know, has a PhD in computer science, I believe it is. And this is kind of what frustrates me about these sorts of things, because Lex Friedman, I think, should know a little bit better, maybe not to morally condemn Lex Friedman for this interview, but he's presenting a very odd comparison. I say it's an odd comparison because how he's situating the conversation is that you have these two positions, the one position being mainline archaeology. I'm just going to say archaeology. The one position being what archaeologists say, and the other position being what Hancock says. And he's presenting them as if they're on equal footing and as if they're on equal grounding. and kind of in a playful way. I don't know if playful's the right word there. Situating it as if they're in an innocent way. I might want to say in an innocent way, asking, well, they're both kind of trying to answer the same sorts of questions. They're both kind of after the same sort of thing. So why is there this friction between them, completely ignoring the fact that Hancock's ideas are fundamentally at odds with archaeology? Hancock is labeled a pseudo-archaeologist, and a lot of people will see that label as an insult, as kind of like an ad hominem attack on Hancock's character. But the reason why he's labeled a pseudo-archaeologist is because his ideas are inherently at odds with the common consensus of archaeologists, in the same way that someone from the anti-vaxxer movement, for example, might be labeled a pseudoscience. So I think the framing of Lex questions inherently off, kind of because of his framing of Hancock's approach as some sort of research paradigm, in a similar way that archaeologists have a research paradigm. But in fact, how Hancock approaches the past is fundamentally at odds with how archaeology approaches the past. They're not starting from the same position. Maybe that's not really clear. Maybe I'll do a different video on that in a different day, but they're fundamentally different methodologies that are being employed. I talked a little bit about that in my other video, my most recent video I made about Hancock, but I might come back to that later. Anyway, enough of my nitpicking about Lex. Let's actually get to what Hancock says.
Real. I think that I cannot speak of all archaeologists, but some archaeologists feel very territorial about their profession, and they do not feel happy about outsiders entering their realm, especially if those outsiders have a large platform. And I've found that the attacks on me by archaeologists have increased step by step with the increase of my exposure. I wasn't very interesting to them when I just had one minor bestseller in 1992 with a book called The Sign and the Seal. But when Fingerprints of the Gods was published in 1995 and became a global bestseller, then I started to attract their attention and appear to have been regarded as a threat to them, and that is the case today.
Okay, so here is the first of two strawman arguments that I wanted to identify, first and foremost, to call attention to, and then to talk about. The first straw man here is that the reason why archaeologists object to Hancock, and this is kind of funny, it's just maybe I'm taking Hancock a little too seriously here, but the first straw man argument is the reason why all of this to-do is being had about Hancock is because archaeologists hate him, because he's popular, because he's the best-selling author, because he's so successful, because he has a Netflix show. It's a humble brag, I guess. He's yeah, I'm not really sure how to frame that. It's a little funny. They hate me because I'm popular. They hate me because I'm successful. Maybe it's a way for him to justify in his head the amount of hate he's. I don't have a psychology background. I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze people, but the straw man here is that he's getting these pushback because he's popular, completely ignoring the actual objections to his ideas that the archaeologists raised. No, that can't be it. It can't be that they have substantive objections to my interpretation of these archaeological sites. That's not what they're objecting to. What they're objecting to is my popularity. But again, maybe that was just kind of a way for Hancock to ease into the conversation, because the crux of the matter, I think, is what he's going to bring up next. So let's go ahead and get to that.
Ancient Apocalypse season 1 was defined as the most dangerous show on Netflix. It's why the Society for American Archaeology wrote an open letter to Netflix asking Netflix to reclassify the series as science fiction. It's why they accused the series of anti-Semitism, misogyny, white supremacism, and a whole, I don't know, a whole bunch of other things like that. They have nothing to do with anything that's in the series. It was like, we must shut this down. This is so dangerous to us. Is it certainly not a danger? There are many more dangerous things in the world than a television series.
Okay, and here's the second straw man that I wanted to identify. That the straw man here being that the reason why the archaeological community objected to ancient apocalypse, the reason why they called ancient apocalypse racist, the reason why they called it anti-Semitic, the reason why they called it dangerous, the reason why they labeled it as dangerous was because Hancock, a non-archaeologist, was imposing himself upon the archaeological field, that they felt threatened, that they felt that they were being undermined, that they felt that what Hancock was doing, I guess going back to the popularity thing, that more people would be listening to Hancock and less people would be listening to them. So to see why this is a classic straw man, let's actually look at the letter that was sent by the Society for American Archaeology to Netflix, the open letter. I'll actually link it in this video below, and to examine some of these claims. All right, so here is the letter by the Society for American Archaeology, writing to address ancient apocalypse. And then we have three principal concerns with regard to ancient apocalypse. First, the host of the series repeatedly and vigorously dismisses archaeologists and the practice of archaeology. Second, Netflix identifies and advertises the series as docu-series, a genre that implies that its content is grounded in fact when the content of the show is not based on false claims. And three, this is what I think Hancock is responding to here, the theory it presents has long-standing association with racist, white supremacist ideologies, does injustice to indigenous people, and emboldens extremists. So Hancock's claim is that the reason why they are saying this is because he, as a non-archaeologist, is imposing himself on archaeology. Now, is that what the letter says? No, it doesn't. Here's what the letter says. I'm just kind of summarizing parts of it. I would encourage you to go read the whole thing. There's also some really awesome links that are mentioned in the letter. The show, not only disparages the cultures of indigenous people, but also carries the harm a step further by disparaging archaeologists. Skipping down, the assertions Hancock makes have a history of promoting dangerous racial thinking. So the assertions of the show have a long history to them. His claim for an advanced global civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by comets is not new. The theory has been presented, debated, and refuted for the last 140 years. It dates to the publication of Atlantis and Ragnarok by Ignatius Donnelly. The theory steals credit for indigenous accomplishments from indigenous people and reinforces white supremacy. So the letter is saying that the reason why these ideas are dangerous is because of the long history of these ideas, the history of these ideas in which they have been used to discredit the accomplishment of indigenous people, to take away from their history, to erase their history, to rewrite, to classically to whitewash their history. Now, Hancock downplays the fact that that could be dangerous, saying that there's much more dangerous ideas and much more dangerous things out there. And this is a straw man because I want you to think about, have these arguments ever been used in a dangerous way? Can we think of examples in which the accomplishments of indigenous people have been downplayed, have been rewritten, have been taken away for them for some sort of sinister end, for some sort of political end? Historically speaking, has there ever been a nation, let's say, that has used similar arguments to take away the sacred land of indigenous people, to say that the sites that have been found on that land were not actually built by the Native Americans, that they were built by, for example, giants or people from Atlantis or anybody else besides the people who lived there? Well, yes. In fact, we have a very concrete, long history of those examples. Just look at some of the speeches of Andrew Jackson. You can look at the resources mentioned here. What is sending up red flags for historians and archaeologists is that these ideas have been used as a justification for on one level, to discredit the work of indigenous people, to take away from their history, to undermine their history, to undermine their accomplishments, but on a more insidious level, on an even more dangerous level, to literally take their land away from them, to take their rights away from them. That has happened. The fact that Hancock does not acknowledge that that has happened, the fact that he's not acknowledging that these arguments, he's seemingly distancing himself from that. But the fact that he's not acknowledging that history is really what's concerned. Well, I can't put words in other people's mouths, but that's what's concerning for me. Why not just come right out and say that? Why not just say, well, yes, it has been used in this way in the past, but that's not what I'm saying. Instead, as we saw with the Dibble debate and as we saw in Ancient Apocalypse, he kind of doubles down on this interpretation. We see that what's brought up in the letter, especially when he doubles down with respect to defending the Spanish accounts. So it's a straw man because you're not engaging with the actual claims of the letter. It wouldn't be a straw man if Hancock devoted an episode, 30 minutes, he has his own platforms, he has his own podcast, to examining the claims of this letter and showing how his ideas are distinct and different from the long history that his ideas seem to be a part of. That's what it would take here. Instead, what we have is Hancock setting himself up almost to be kind of a martyr figure, that he is coming to the archaeological community with these strange, new, different ideas, and that he's being shut down by big archaeology, that he's being targeted by the academic community because they don't like his ideas, because they don't like him, because they don't like how popular he is. But in presenting himself in that way, he's completely ignoring the actual objections, both the substantive objections to the content claims that he's making about the different archaeological sites, and the substantive objections to the history of the ideas that he's promoting, that he, for some reason, has refused to engage with, at least as far as I'm aware. If you have podcasts or shows in which he does engage with that, please, by all means, share those in the comments section below. All right, well, I'm going to end the video there. By all means, let me know what you think of the Lex Friedman interview, what you think of the upcoming season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse. And yeah, I look forward to arguing with you in the comments section. Until next time, I'll see you all later. Thank you.